close your eyes for a moment. Go back with me. Back to a time when the world moved a little slower. When trust wasn't a luxury, it was simply the way things worked. It's November 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, Wednesday afternoon. America is winding down, caught in that gentle exhale before the holiday. Kitchens smell of butter and sage. Department store windows gleam with promises of Black Friday deals that actually mean something. On television, families gather around rabbit-eared sets watching football, sitcoms, the evening news with Walter Cronkite. The Vietnam War still rages overseas. Richard Nixon sits in the White House. The Beatles broke up just last year, and the wound still feels fresh. Gas costs 36 cents a gallon. A new car will set you back $3,000. And if you want to fly, you simply walk into the airport, buy a ticket and board. No questions, no searches, no suspicion. Because in 1971, hijacking was something that happened in movies, in spy novels, in other countries maybe, but not here. Not on a quiet Wednesday afternoon in Portland, Oregon. This is where our story begins. With rain, with routine, with a man in a business suit who would change everything. Portland International Airport, early afternoon. The terminal hums with that particular energy of pre-holiday travel, a mixture of excitement and exhaustion. Families wrangle children and luggage. Businessmen check their watches, briefcases in hand, ready to close one more deal before the long weekend. The smell is distinct if you remember it. Cigarette smoke, cheap coffee, jet fuel seeping in from the tarmac, and the faint trace of perfume and aftershave. Everyone smokes. On the plane, in the terminal, the pilot smokes, the passengers smoke. The air itself seems permanently hazed, caught between the fluorescent lights and the grey November sky outside. Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 sits waiting at the gate. A Boeing 727-100, sleek, modern for its time, with its distinctive T-tail and rear-mounted engines, the workhorse of American aviation. Reliable, familiar. Boarding is relaxed. A young woman tears your ticket stub, smiles, points you down the jetway. No metal detectors, no X-ray machines. Your bags aren't searched. You aren't questioned. The 727 can carry up to 131 passengers, but today it's light. Thanksgiving Eve. Most people drove, or they're already where they're going. Only 36 passengers checked in for this short hop to Seattle. A 30-minute flight. Barely enough time for a drink and a magazine. Among them, salesmen heading home, college students, a few families. Anonymous faces you'd pass on any street in America. People thinking about turkey, about reunions, about anything except danger. And then there was him. He arrived alone, no fanfare, no nervousness, just another businessman at the end of a long day. He paid cash for his ticket, one way, Portland to Seattle, $20. The name on the ticket read, Dan Cooper. The ticket agent didn't look twice, why would she? He was polite, well-dressed, unremarkable in every conceivable way. Let me paint you a picture of this man, because every detail matters. Every detail would later be studied, dissected, theorized over for decades. He wore a dark suit, not expensive but respectable, the kind a manager might wear, or an engineer. Dark, possibly black or navy. A white dress shirt, pressed and clean, and a narrow black tie, clipped to his chest with a tie clip. A small detail that spoke to a certain generation, a certain formality that was fading even then. His shoes were polished, black loafers perhaps, or Oxfords. His hair was dark, combed back neatly, receding at the temples. He was middle-aged, somewhere in his mid-40s, witnesses would later say. Maybe 5'10", 5'11". Average build, maybe 170 pounds. Olive-skinned, some said, or deeply tanned. He might have been Italian, Greek, Mexican, French, or just a white man who spent time outdoors. His most distinctive feature? His eyes. Calm, dark, penetrating without being threatening. The kind of eyes that made you think he was listening when you spoke. The kind of eyes that revealed nothing. In his hand, he carried a plain brown briefcase. Nothing special. The kind you could buy at any Sears or J.C. Penney. and a paper bag. Simple, brown, unassuming. He boarded the plane without incident, made his way down the narrow aisle, past rows of avocado green and burnt orange seats, the colors of the era. He chose seat 18E, last row, window seat, right side. The loudest part of the plane, where the engines scream during takeoff, where most people don't want to sit. But he did, deliberately, quietly. He settled in, placed his briefcase on his lap and waited. Flight attendant Florence Schaffner noticed him, but only barely. He was polite when she checked on him, ordered a bourbon and soda, paid in cash, lit a cigarette, a rally, some would later remember, and gazed out the rain-streaked window as the engines began to whine. At 2:50 p.m., the boarding door sealed shut. The jetway pulled away, and Flight 305 began to taxi toward the runway. Nobody knew. Not the crew, not the passengers, not the FBI agents who at that very moment were sitting in offices downtown, drinking coffee, thinking about tomorrow's holiday. Nobody knew that in less than an hour, the man in 18E would become the only hijacker in American history to successfully escape with ransom money and never be caught. The flight took off smoothly, wheels up at 3:07 p.m. The 727 banked north, climbing through the dense cloud cover. Rain pelted the windows. The cabin settled into that familiar rhythm. The drone of engines, the clink of ice in plastic cups, muted conversations, the rustle of newspapers. Florence Schaffner moved through the cabin with practiced ease. She'd been flying for Northwest Orient for years. She knew the routine. Smile, serve, stay alert, but not anxious. Most passengers were already half asleep or lost in their own thoughts. She passed row 18. The man in the suit glanced up, made brief eye contact. Then, without a word, he handed her a folded piece of paper. Florence barely looked at it. She'd seen this before. Lonely businessmen passing notes with phone numbers. Awkward flirtations at 30,000 feet. She slipped it into her pocket and kept moving. But then, his voice. Quiet, steady, perfectly calm. "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The words cut through the engine noise like a blade. Florence froze. For just a second, time stretched. The cabin seemed to grow distant, unreal. She turned slowly, met his eyes. He wasn't joking. He wasn't smiling. He was simply waiting. She pulled the note from her pocket. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, block letters, precise. No spelling errors, no hesitation. It read, "Miss, I have a bomb in my briefcase. I will use it if necessary. I want you to sit next to me. You are being hijacked." Below that, demands. $200,000 in $20 bills, 4 parachutes, fuel waiting in Seattle. No tricks, no police, or everyone dies. Florence looked up. Her training kicked in. Don't panic, don't alert the other passengers, assess the threat. She looked at the briefcase on his lap. He must have seen the question in her eyes because without a word he opened it. Just a few inches. Just enough. Inside, red cylinders, wires, a battery, all neatly arranged. Whether it was real or fake didn't matter in that moment. It looked real. And in a pressurized aluminum tube flying at 10,000 feet, that was enough. "Sit down," he said gently. Not a command, almost a request. "Please." She sat, and the hijacking began. In the cockpit, Captain William Scott received word from Schaffner via the intercom. His face didn't change. Years of training took over. First Officer Bob Ratachak glanced at him. Flight Engineer H.E. Anderson leaned in. Scott showed them the note. For a moment, nobody spoke. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not on a domestic flight, not on Thanksgiving Eve, but it was happening, right now, right here. Scott contacted air traffic control, coded language, calm voice. "We have a situation. Notify the authorities. Do not, I repeat, do not cause alarm. We are complying with demands." Down below, in Seattle, the FBI's office erupted into controlled chaos. Agents scrambled, phone calls were made, the airline's executives were notified, the president's office would be briefed within hours. $200,000. In 1971, that's equivalent to over $1.5 million today. And it needed to be in $20 bills. Used, non-sequential if possible. Gathered, packed and delivered to the airport in less than 2 hours. Banks were called, tellers worked frantically, pulling bills, logging serial numbers when they could. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't organized, but it was happening, because 36 innocent people were in the air with a man holding what he claimed was a bomb. Meanwhile, on the plane, something strange was unfolding. The passengers noticed nothing. Cooper had made sure of that. Schaffner moved through the cabin as usual, though her hands shook slightly as she poured drinks. The other flight attendants, Tina Mucklow and Alice Hancock, were brought into the loop quietly, efficiently. No panic, no shouting, just calm, terrifying professionalism. Cooper himself remained bizarrely courteous. He ordered another bourbon. He asked Schaffner if she was okay. He even smiled once or twice, not cruelly but almost apologetically, as if he regretted the inconvenience. He didn't threaten anyone, didn't raise his voice, didn't wave the briefcase around. He simply sat there, smoking his cigarette, watching the clouds roll by, utterly in control. It was this calmness, this eerie composure, that would later haunt investigators. Because this wasn't the behavior of a desperate man. This was someone who had planned every detail, who knew exactly what he was doing, and who had no intention of being caught. At 5:24 p.m., Flight 305 touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The rain had intensified. The sky was bruised and dark. Emergency vehicles surrounded the tarmac, lights flashing, but keeping their distance. The FBI was there, SWAT teams, negotiators, all waiting, all watching. Cooper's demands had been met. The money was ready. The parachutes, 2 primary, 2 reserve, were gathered from a local skydiving school. A fuel truck stood by. The plane taxied to a remote part of the airport, away from the main terminal. The engines idled, and Cooper gave his next instruction. Release the passengers. One by one they deplaned, confused, irritated by the delay, still unaware that they'd just been part of a hijacking. Some complained about missing their connections. Others were just relieved to be on the ground. None of them looked back. Now it was just Cooper, the flight crew, and 2 flight attendants. The money was delivered. The parachutes were brought aboard. Tina Mucklow, the youngest attendant, stayed with Cooper. She would later describe him as polite, even kind. He thanked her, told her she was doing a great job, and then he made his final demand. Refuel the plane, set a course for Mexico City, fly low and slow, cabin unpressurized, rear stairs down, and everyone stays in the cockpit. The crew exchanged glances. They knew what this meant. He was going to jump into a storm at night over the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, with $200,000 strapped to his body. It was insane. It was impossible. It was brilliant. At 7:40 p.m., Flight 305 took off again, this time with only 6 people aboard, 5 crew members in the cockpit, and 1 man in the back, alone in the dimly lit cabin, preparing to do the unthinkable. The mystery of D.B. Cooper had truly begun. Florence Schaffner felt the world tilt beneath her feet, not from turbulence, not from the gentle banking of the aircraft as it climbed northward through the grey November sky, but from those 7 words, spoken so calmly, so matter-of-factly, that for a moment she wondered if she'd heard them correctly. "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Her hands trembled as she pulled the folded paper from her pocket. The cabin noise around her seemed to fade into a dull roar, the businessman reading newspapers, the young mother 2 rows up, bouncing a fussy toddler, the elderly couple holding hands. All of it suddenly felt impossibly fragile, as if the entire aircraft were made of glass. She unfolded the note. Block letters, neat, no smudges, no corrections, written with the precision of someone who had practiced this moment perhaps many times. The message was direct. I have a bomb in my briefcase. I will use it if necessary. I want you to sit next to me. You are being hijacked. Below that, a list. Not frantic demands scrawled in desperation, but a methodical inventory of requirements. $200,000, 4 parachutes, fuel, instructions for the flight path, and a warning, underlined twice. No tricks, no police involvement during the exchange, or the consequences would be catastrophic. Florence's training kicked in. Years of dealing with difficult passengers, medical emergencies, engine troubles. Stay calm. Assess the situation. Don't escalate. She looked up at the man in 18E. His expression hadn't changed. He wasn't smiling, wasn't frowning, just waiting, patient, as if he had all the time in the world. She walked back to him slowly, her legs feeling disconnected from her body. He gestured to the empty seat beside him, seat 18D. She sat down, maintaining her professional composure, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm going to show you something," he said quietly. "I need you to understand this is real." He placed his hand on the briefcase in his lap. Then, with deliberate slowness, he opened the latch and tilted the lid toward her. Just a few inches, just enough. What Florence Schaffner saw in that moment would stay with her for the rest of her life. 8 red cylinders, each about 6 inches long, arranged in 2 neat rows. They looked like road flares or dynamite. She couldn't be sure. Wires snaked between them, red and green and yellow, connecting to what appeared to be a large battery, a tangle of electrical components, and there, nestled among the wires, something that might have been a timer or a switch. Real or fake. In that moment it didn't matter. At 30,000 feet, in a thin aluminum tube carrying dozens of innocent people, the possibility alone was enough. Florence nodded slowly, and Cooper closed the briefcase with a soft click. "Good," he said. "Now here's what's going to happen." His voice remained calm, almost conversational. He explained his demands in careful detail. The money had to be in $20 bills, unmarked, not sequentially numbered. The parachutes needed to be military grade, 2 primary chutes and 2 reserves. The plane would land in Seattle, take on the money and parachutes, refuel, and then take off again toward Mexico City. But there were conditions about how they would fly. Low altitude, unpressurized cabin, flaps down to reduce speed. Every detail revealed something crucial. This wasn't a desperate man making impossible demands. This was someone who understood aviation, who knew about parachutes, who had calculated the weight of $200,000 in $20 bills and knew it could be carried by one person. This was someone who had thought through every variable. Florence excused herself, keeping her expression neutral as she made her way forward. The other passengers barely glanced at her. Why would they? Everything seemed normal. The drink service was continuing. Someone asked for a pillow. A businessman requested coffee. She entered the cockpit and closed the door behind her. Captain William Scott turned in his seat. He was a veteran pilot, grey-haired, steady-handed. He'd flown in World War II, navigated storms, managed engine failures. But when Florence handed him the note and explained what she'd seen in the briefcase, his face went pale. First Officer Bob Ratachak leaned over to read it. Flight Engineer H.E. Anderson adjusted his glasses and read it again, as if hoping the words might change on a second pass. For a long moment nobody spoke. The only sound was the steady hum of the engines, the crackle of the radio, the whisper of air moving past the fuselage. Scott broke the silence. His voice was measured, controlled. "Contact Seattle Center. Tell them we have a hijacking situation. Use code if you have to, but make them understand. We need the FBI. We need those demands met. And we need it done before we run out of fuel." The co-pilot reached for the radio. His hand was steady, but his voice betrayed the tension. "Seattle Center, Northwest 305. We have a situation on board. Need to speak with ground security immediately, requesting priority handling." The response came back confused at first, then urgent. Within minutes, the FBI field office in Seattle was alerted. Agents grabbed coats and weapons. Phones rang in bank offices across the city. The clock had started ticking. The FBI assigned the case a codename immediately. NORJAC, Northwest Hijacking. It would become one of the most extensive and exhaustive investigations in Bureau history. But right now, In those first chaotic minutes, nobody knew what they were dealing with. Was this man a terrorist? A political radical? Vietnam was still raging. There were bombings, protests, a deep distrust of authorities simmering across the country. Was this connected? But Cooper had made no political statements, no manifestos, no demands beyond money and parachutes. That in itself was telling. Back on the plane, Florence returned to her post. She had to inform the other flight attendants without alerting the passengers. Alice Hancock and Tina Mucklow were brought into the confidence. Their faces registered shock, but they nodded. The show would go on. Drinks would be served. Smiles would be maintained. The passengers would be kept calm, kept unaware. Cooper ordered another bourbon and soda. He paid in cash, exact change, and thanked Florence politely. He lit another cigarette, a Raleigh filter, and gazed out the rain-streaked window at the darkening sky below. Hours passed. The longest hours of Florence Schaffner's life. Flight 305 couldn't land yet. The demands hadn't been met, so Captain Scott requested a holding pattern over Puget Sound. The plane flew in wide, lazy circles, burning fuel, buying time. Scott told the passengers there was a minor mechanical issue, a hydraulic indicator light. They'd be landing shortly. Most passengers shrugged. A few grumbled. One man asked if he'd make his connection to San Francisco. Nobody panicked. Nobody suspected. Down below, Seattle had erupted into controlled chaos. FBI agents descended on the Northwest Orient Airlines offices. They commandeered phone lines, set up a command center. The airline's president was notified. So was the governor. Word reached Washington, D.C. The president would be briefed within hours. But first, the immediate problem. $200,000 in $20 bills. In 1971, that was a staggering sum, equivalent to over $1.5 million today, and it had to be gathered in less than 3 hours. Banks across Seattle opened their vaults. Tellers pulled stacks of 20s, counting frantically. The FBI issued specific instructions. Avoid sequential bills if possible. Try to gather older currency, harder to trace, but speed was paramount. As the bills piled up, FBI forensic teams made a critical decision. They would photograph every single bill. Using microfilm technology, they captured the serial numbers of all 10,000 $20 bills. It was tedious work, but it created an indelible record. If even one of those bills surfaced anywhere in the world, they'd know it. The money was packed into a canvas bank bag, the kind used for transporting large cash deposits. It weighed about 21 pounds, heavy but manageable for one person. Meanwhile, at McCord Air Force Base, just south of Seattle, personnel scrambled to locate parachutes. Cooper had asked for 4, 2 primary parachutes and 2 reserves. The Air Force pulled them from their training inventory. Here, the FBI made a calculated, chilling decision. They couldn't risk Cooper forcing a crew member to jump with him. If he took a hostage, they needed to protect that person. So they provided 2 fully functional parachutes and 2 that were either outdated, improperly packed, or subtly compromised. The theory was simple. If Cooper made someone else jump, he'd give them the good chute and be forced to use a bad one himself. It was a dark gamble, but in a situation with no good options, it was the best they had. The rain intensified as evening fell. Seattle's notorious November weather rolled in thick and heavy. Wind gusted across the tarmac. Visibility dropped. For the agents and airline personnel working frantically to meet the demands, the weather was an enemy. But for Cooper, if he truly intended to jump, it might be an ally. Darkness and storm clouds could hide a parachutist better than any camouflage. At 5:24 p.m., nearly 3 hours after the hijacking began, Captain Scott received clearance. The demands had been met. He could bring the plane in. Flight 305 descended through the rain, landing lights cutting through the gloom. The runway lights at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport glowed like a string of wet pearls. The 727 touched down smoothly, tires kissing the wet pavement. Scott taxied away from the main terminal, following instructions radioed from the tower. They directed him to a remote, isolated section of the airport, far from other aircraft and passengers. Emergency vehicles ringed the area, lights flashing silently. FBI agents crouched behind cars. Sharpshooters took positions on the roofs of nearby buildings. SWAT teams waited, weapons ready. The entire scene was lit by portable floodlights that turned the rain into sheets of silver. But Cooper had given strict instructions. Nobody was to approach the plane except one unarmed airline employee to deliver the money and parachutes. The aircraft came to a stop, engines still running. The forward door opened. A mobile stairway was rolled into position. An airline operations manager, a man named Al Lee, climbed the stairs alone. He carried the canvas bag of money in one hand and the bulky parachute bag in the other. His heart pounded as he stepped into the cabin. Florence Schaffner met him at the door. She took the bags without a word and brought them back to Cooper. He inspected the contents carefully, opened the canvas bag and ran his hands through the stacks of bills, unzipped the parachute bag and examined each chute, checking harnesses, clips, ripcords. He took his time, methodical, thorough. Finally, he nodded. "It's good." Then came the moment that would define his place in criminal history. The moment that separated him from terrorists and murderers and common thugs. "Release the passengers," he said. Florence stared at him. "All of them?" "All of them. The passengers and Florence, you can go too. But I need one attendant to stay, and the flight crew stays." Tina Mucklow, the youngest flight attendant, volunteered to remain. She was 23 years old, calm under pressure, and somehow sensed that staying might be the safest thing for everyone. The cabin door opened again. The passengers were told they could deplane. Confused faces, relieved faces. Some people asked what was happening. Others just wanted off the plane, out of the cold rain and into the terminal. They filed out in an orderly line, down the wet stairs, escorted by airline personnel who herded them quickly toward waiting buses. Not one of them knew. Not one of them realized that they'd just been hostages in a hijacking. Some complained about the delay. Others worried about missing connections. A few joked about the mechanical problems. They would learn the truth hours later, watching the news from hotel rooms and airport bars, their faces draining of color as they realized how close they'd come to disaster. Florence Schaffner descended the stairs last, her legs shaking, tears streaming down her face. She'd held it together for hours, but now, finally on solid ground, the weight of it hit her. An FBI agent wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and guided her toward a waiting car. Back on the plane, it was just 6 people now. Captain Scott, First Officer Ratachak, Flight Engineer Anderson, and in the cabin, Cooper and Tina Mucklow. The door closed. The stairs were rolled away. The floodlights illuminated the lonely 727 sitting on the dark tarmac, rain hammering its aluminum skin. Cooper's voice came over the intercom. Calm, clear, polite as ever. "Captain, I need you to do exactly as I say." And then he gave the final instructions, the ones that would seal his legend forever. The plane was to be refueled. They would take off and head south, toward Mexico City, but they wouldn't fly the normal route. Cooper specified, altitude no higher than 10,000 feet, speed no faster than 170 knots, flaps lowered to 15 degrees, cabin unpressurized, landing gear down. And one more thing. The rear air stair door, the stairs that extended from the back of the plane, those were to remain unlocked, open if necessary. The flight crew exchanged glances. They knew what this meant. He was going to jump. In the middle of the night, in a rainstorm, over the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. It was suicide, madness, impossible. But Cooper had thought of everything else. Maybe, just maybe, he'd thought of this too. At 7:40 p.m., more than 4 hours after the hijacking began, Flight 305 roared down the runway once more. Its wheels left the ground. It climbed slowly, sluggishly, weighed down by the unusual configuration Cooper had demanded. Inside, the cabin lights were dim. Tina Mucklow sat in the cockpit with the crew as instructed. Cooper was alone in the back, alone with $200,000, 2 parachutes, and a plan that defied all logic. The mystery of D.B. Cooper was about to reach its climax, but the question remained. Would he survive what came next? The engines of Flight 305 roared back to life at 7:40 p.m. The sound was different now, heavier, labored. The plane wasn't configured for normal flight, and every system on board knew it. Inside the cockpit, Captain William Scott pushed the throttles forward, feeling the sluggish response of the aircraft. The landing gear was down, creating massive drag. The flaps were extended to 15 degrees, further slowing the plane. They would be flying at barely above stalling speed, fighting gravity and aerodynamics with every second. First Officer Bob Ratachak checked the instruments one more time. Airspeed, 170 knots maximum. Altitude, 10,000 feet, no higher. Cabin pressure, off. He looked at Scott. Neither man spoke. They both knew what these specifications meant. This wasn't a flight plan, it was a jump protocol. Behind them, flight engineer H.E. Anderson monitored the fuel consumption. At this speed, at this altitude, with this configuration, they were burning fuel at an alarming rate. Mexico City was over 2,000 miles away. They wouldn't make it, not even close. But Cooper had to know that, which meant Mexico City wasn't his real destination. It was misdirection, theater. In the cabin, Tina Mucklow sat alone in the first-class section, as far from the back of the plane as possible. Cooper had been clear. Stay forward, stay out of the way, don't look back. She could hear him moving around in the rear of the aircraft, the sound of fabric rustling, metal clips clicking, the scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor. She wondered if she should be terrified. Part of her was, but another part of her felt an odd, detached calm. He'd had hours to hurt someone. He hadn't. He'd released the passengers when he could have kept them. Whatever he wasn't a monster. Still, she didn't turn around. The plane climbed slowly through the storm. Rain hammered the fuselage in sheets. Wind buffeted them from side to side. Outside the windows there was nothing but darkness. No city lights below, no stars above, just the void. And the rain. And the steady drone of engines straining against impossible conditions. On the ground, chaos reigned. At McCord Air Force Base, 2 F-106 Delta Dart fighters had been scrambled minutes after Flight 305 took off. These were interceptors built for speed, designed to chase down Soviet bombers at Mach 2. But tonight they were being asked to do something they were never designed for: shadow a slow-moving commercial airliner in a storm. The pilots struggled. At the 727's cruising speed of 170 knots, the F-106s were dangerously close to their own stall speed. They had to fly in wide circles, constantly adjusting, trying to keep the Boeing in sight without flying too close, too fast, or too slow. The weather made it nearly impossible. Clouds obscured everything. Rain turned their canopies into blurred sheets of water. Radar could track the 727, but visual confirmation was sporadic at best. One of the fighter pilots radioed back to base. "We can't maintain visual. Target keeps disappearing in the clouds. Request permission to close distance." The response came back tense. "Negative. Maintain separation. Do not spook the target. Repeat, do not alert hijacker to your presence." The jets fell back, circling high and wide, trying to track the lumbering transport as it flew south into the heart of the Cascade Mountains. Inside the 727, Cooper worked methodically. He had stripped off his suit jacket and draped it over one of the seats. His tie, the black clip-on tie that had become part of his signature look, lay discarded beside it. He wore only his white shirt now, sleeves still buttoned at the wrists. Over this, he pulled on the parachute harness. The parachutes the FBI had provided were military surplus, the kind used by paratroopers. Not sport rigs, not the lightweight gear a recreational jumper would use, but heavy-duty, main and reserve systems designed for combat drops. Cooper examined each one carefully. He tested the straps, checked the ripcords, ran his hands over the fabric of the canopies. He chose one of the main parachutes and secured it to his back, adjusting the leg straps and chest strap until the fit was snug. Then he did something unexpected. He took one of the reserve parachutes, a smaller front-mounted chute meant to be worn on the chest as a backup, and cut it open with a pocket knife. He pulled out the nylon cords inside, yards and yards of strong suspension line. He used these cords to secure the canvas bank bag to his body, tying it carefully around his waist and shoulders. 21 pounds of cash, 10,000 bills, wrapped and bound against his torso. It was brilliant in its simplicity. If he'd just held the bag, the opening shock of the parachute would have ripped it from his hands. If he tried to put it in a backpack, the weight distribution would have been dangerous. But tied to his body this way, secured with military-grade cord, it would stay with him through the jump, through the landing, through whatever came next. He put his suit jacket back on over the parachute harness. It barely fit now, stretched tight across the bulk of the equipment. He picked up his raincoat, a thin, dark overcoat he'd been wearing when he boarded, and pulled it on as well. Then he slipped his sunglasses into his shirt pocket. Dark aviator sunglasses, in the middle of the night, just in case. Everything he did suggested planning, preparation. This wasn't improvisation. This was execution of a long-considered plan. At 8 p.m., Cooper walked forward to where Tina Mucklow sat. She looked up at him. His appearance had changed completely. The businessman was gone. In his place stood something else. A soldier, maybe. A ghost. "I need you to go to the cockpit now," he said. His voice was the same. Calm, polite, no urgency, no fear. "Close the door, lock it. Don't come out until we land." "Where are we going to land?" she asked. He smiled slightly. "Reno. Tell the captain to continue on the current heading. Maintain altitude and speed. I'll let you know when I'm gone." "How will we know?" "You'll know." She stood, her legs unsteady. "Are you going to be okay?" The question surprised him. You could see it in his eyes. Here was a woman who'd spent hours as his hostage, terrified, uncertain, and her instinct was still to ask if he would be okay. "I'll be fine," he said. "Thank you for your help." She nodded and walked to the cockpit door. She knocked twice. Captain Scott opened it. She slipped inside, and the door closed behind her with a solid click. Cooper was alone. He made his way to the back of the plane, past rows of empty seats. His footsteps echoed in the cabin. Outside the windows, the darkness was total. No moon, no stars, just rain and clouds and the invisible landscape far below. At the rear of the aircraft, he found what he was looking for. The aft air stair, a unique feature of the Boeing 727, a retractable stairway built into the tail section that could be lowered in flight. It was designed for ground operations, for boarding passengers when jet bridges weren't available. But Cooper had discovered, as had a handful of other criminals before him, that it could be opened mid-flight. There was a control lever on the cabin wall. He gripped it firmly and pulled. Nothing happened. He pulled harder. Still nothing. The mechanism was locked, probably by the pilots from the cockpit. He'd anticipated this. He made his way to the intercom phone mounted on the bulkhead and picked it up. In the cockpit, the phone buzzed. Scott answered. "Captain, I need you to unlock the aft air stair." Scott's hand hovered over the control switch. "Are you sure you want to do this? The weather is terrible. Visibility is 0. You won't be able to see the ground." "Unlock the stairs, Captain." Scott flipped the switch. In the back of the plane, Cooper heard a mechanical clunk as the lock disengaged. He pulled the lever again. This time it moved. Slowly, with a hydraulic whine, the air stair began to lower. The change was immediate and violent. A shrieking wind tore through the cabin as the stairs extended into the slipstream. The temperature plummeted. The pressurized warmth of the cabin was sucked out into the freezing November night. Rain blasted through the opening, soaking everything. The noise was deafening, a roar that drowned out even the scream of the engines. Cooper braced himself against the fuselage, feeling the aircraft shudder and buck. The pilots would feel this too. The sudden drag, the shift in aerodynamics. The plane was barely controllable now, wallowing through the sky like a wounded animal. He moved to the edge of the stairs. The wind pulled at him, trying to rip him off his feet. He gripped the sides of the opening and looked down. Nothing. Just blackness. The stairs extended down into the void, rain-slicked metal disappearing into the dark. Below that, 2 miles of empty air, and somewhere at the bottom, the forests of Washington state, trees, mountains, rivers, or rocks, or death. For the first time that day, Cooper hesitated. In the cockpit, the crew was fighting to keep the plane stable. The stick shook in Scott's hands. Warning lights flashed. The aircraft was trying to pitch nose up, wanting to stall. "I've got pressure anomaly," Anderson called out. "Aft cabin is wide open." "Hold her steady," Scott said through gritted teeth. Ratachak stared at the instruments. Airspeed dropping. We're at 160, 155. They were on the edge of disaster. If the plane stalled at this altitude in these conditions, recovery would be nearly impossible. Scott added power, feeling the engines surge. The nose came down slightly. The airspeed stabilized. And then, at exactly 8:13 p.m., the pressure gauge spiked. A distinct change, a sudden equalization. As if a weight had been removed from the tail of the aircraft, the plane lurched upward, suddenly lighter. Scott fought the controls. "Did you feel that?" "Yeah," Ratachak said. "Yeah, I felt it." They looked at each other. They both knew what it meant. He was gone. Somewhere over the Cascade Mountains, in the driving rain, in total darkness, Dan Cooper had stepped off the stairs of Flight 305 and vanished into the night. The crew maintained their course for another 20 minutes, following Cooper's final instructions. They didn't climb, didn't speed up, didn't deviate, just in case he was still back there, just in case he was watching somehow. But he wasn't. They knew he wasn't. At 8:35 p.m., Scott finally spoke. "Close the aft air stair. Let's get this thing on the ground." The stairs retracted with a hydraulic whine. The cabin pressure stabilized. The temperature began to rise. The screaming wind faded to the familiar hum of the engines. Tina Mucklow emerged from the cockpit, pale and shaking. She walked slowly to the back of the plane, past all those empty seats. The rear cabin was a mess, water everywhere, seats soaked. And there, on seat 18C, Cooper's tie. His clip-on tie, black and narrow, lying exactly where he'd left it. Beside it, one of the parachutes he hadn't used. And scattered across several seats, 8 cigarette butts. Raleigh filters, smoked down to the stub. That was all. No note, no farewell message, no explanation. Just evidence of a man who had been there, and now wasn't. Flight 305 landed in Reno, Nevada, at 10:15 p.m. The plane was immediately surrounded by FBI agents, local police, airport security. They swarmed the aircraft like ants, weapons drawn, expecting confrontation. But there was no one to confront. The hijacker was gone. The crew was escorted off the plane and separated for interrogation. Every item in the cabin was photographed, catalogued, bagged as evidence. The tie, the parachute, the cigarette butts. Even the bourbon glass Cooper had used, still sitting in the armrest cup holder, was carefully preserved. The FBI launched the largest manhunt in American history. Every available agent was mobilized. Search teams combed the wilderness of southern Washington. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the forests. Ground crews hiked through dense timber, looking for any sign of a parachute, a body, a bag of money. They found nothing. Days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to months. The search area expanded, then expanded again. Hundreds of square miles of rugged terrain, scoured inch by inch. Rivers were dragged. Caves were explored. Hunters and hikers were interviewed. Every possible lead was pursued. Nothing. Not a footprint, not a scrap of fabric, not a single $20 bill. It was as if Dan Cooper had simply ceased to exist the moment he stepped off those stairs. As if he'd jumped not into the air, but into some other dimension, where the laws of physics and evidence didn't apply. The questions haunted the investigators. Did he survive the jump? It seemed impossible. Jumping at night, in a storm, over mountains, with no knowledge of the terrain below. Professional skydivers said it was suicide. The wind chill alone would have been lethal. The impact, even with a functioning parachute, could have killed him. But then again, everything about this case seemed impossible. And yet it had happened. Could he have died in the woods? His body hidden by the dense forest, slowly decomposing where it fell. Possible, even likely. But wouldn't someone have found something by now? A hiker, a hunter, a logger. Someone? Or had he actually made it? Had he landed safely, buried the parachute, changed his clothes, walked out of the forest, and disappeared into normal life? Was he somewhere right now, living under a new name, spending those 20s a few at a time, careful never to draw attention? The FBI didn't know. The public didn't know. And 50 years later, we still don't know. Dan Cooper, the man who became D.B. Cooper through a media error that stuck, had accomplished what no criminal in American history had done before or since. He had committed the perfect crime. Not because he got away with the money, but because he got away with the mystery. He left behind more questions than answers, more theories than facts, more legend than truth. And somewhere, in the dark forests of the Pacific Northwest, the answer waits, silent, hidden, patient. Maybe it always will be. The morning of November 25th, 1971, dawned cold and grey across the Pacific Northwest. Thanksgiving Day. Families were gathering, turkeys were roasting, children were playing with new toys. But in federal offices across Washington State, Oregon, and Nevada, there was no holiday. There was only the case. Norjack, Northwest hijacking. Already it was the largest active investigation the FBI had ever mounted, and it had only just begun. Special Agent Ralph Himmelsbach stood in a temporary command post at the Portland FBI field office, staring at a large topographical map pinned to the wall. Red circles marked the possible jump zone, calculated from the flight path of Northwest 305, the time of the pressure change at 8:13 p.m., the plane's altitude and speed. The area was vast, hundreds of square miles of the most unforgiving terrain in the lower 48 states. The Cascade Range. Dense, old-growth forest, some of it never logged, never even explored. Mountains rising 6, 7, 8,000 feet. Deep ravines carved by glacial rivers. And in November, all of it cold, wet, and nearly impenetrable. Himmelsbach would spend the next decade of his life chasing this case. It would consume him, haunt him, define his career. Years later, he would write a book about it, still bitter, still frustrated by the man who got away. But on this first morning, there was still hope, still confidence. The FBI was the most advanced law enforcement agency in the world. They had resources, technology, manpower. Surely they would find something. A parachute snagged in a tree, a body broken on the rocks, the money scattered across a hillside. Something. The search began at dawn. Military helicopters from McCord Air Force Base lifted off in station, flying grid patterns over the dense forest. Observers hung out of open doors, scanning the canopy below with binoculars. They were looking for anything out of place. A splash of white nylon against the green. A disturbance in the trees. Smoke from a campfire, if by some miracle Cooper had survived and was trying to signal for help. They found nothing but trees. Endless trees, stretching to the horizon in every direction. On the ground, search teams assembled. Local police, forest rangers, volunteer mountaineers, bloodhounds. They gathered at logging roads and trailheads, organizing into groups, each assigned a sector. The plan was systematic. Walk every inch, look under every log, check every cave and ravine. The terrain fought them at every step. The undergrowth was so thick in places that visibility was measured in feet, not yards. Blackberry brambles tore at clothing and skin. Fallen logs, slick with moss and rain, became treacherous obstacles. And everywhere, the mud. Thick, sucking mud that grabbed boots and made every step exhausting. The weather didn't help. The storm that had covered Cooper's jump continued for days. Rain fell in sheets. Streams became torrents. The already difficult search became nearly impossible. Helicopters were grounded. Ground teams returned to base, soaked, exhausted, empty-handed. Days became weeks. The initial urgency began to fade, replaced by grim determination. The FBI brought in experts. Parachute specialists from the military analyzed the jump conditions. They ran calculations, wind speed, terminal velocity, probable drift. They narrowed the search area, then narrowed it again. Still nothing. Divers were sent into the Columbia River, working in teams, dragging the bottom with hooks and nets. The river was freezing, the current treacherous. They found old tires, shopping carts, rusted machinery. No parachute, no body, no money. Lake Merwin, a reservoir just south of the probable jump zone, was searched next. It was deeper, colder, darker. Sonar equipment was brought in, scanning the murky depths for any anomaly. Divers descended into the black water, visibility zero, working by touch alone. Nothing. The investigation shifted focus. If they couldn't find physical evidence, maybe they could find the man through detective work. Who was Dan Cooper? The name was clearly an alias. The ticket agent in Portland remembered him vaguely but couldn't provide much detail. He'd paid cash, given no address, showed no identification. In 1971, that was perfectly legal. The FBI interviewed everyone who'd seen him: the ticket agent, the flight attendants, the pilots, the passengers who'd sat near him. They brought in a sketch artist. Florence Schaffner worked with the artist for hours, trying to capture the face she'd seen. The resulting composite was distributed to every law enforcement agency in the country, published in newspapers, shown on television. Tips poured in, thousands of them. Every ex-military parachutist in the Pacific Northwest became a suspect. Every man who'd recently bought a plane ticket with cash. Every husband who'd disappeared on Thanksgiving Eve. The FBI investigated them all. Alibis were checked, backgrounds examined, bank accounts scrutinized. None of them were Cooper. The case developed its own mythology. Theories proliferated. Was Cooper a disgruntled airline employee, someone who knew the Boeing 727 inside and out? Was he military, maybe special forces, trained in high-altitude jumps? Was he a professional criminal, someone who'd planned this for years? Or was he just a desperate man, an accountant or engineer who'd lost his job, lost his family, and decided to go out in a blaze of glory? The lack of evidence meant every theory was possible. Every theory was equally unprovable. One detail haunted investigators: the money. 10,000 $20 bills, each serial number photographed and recorded. It was the perfect trap. Whoever Cooper was, wherever he'd gone, eventually he'd have to spend the money. And when he did, the FBI would be waiting. Banks across the country were notified. Every $20 bill that passed through their hands was to be checked against the list. It was tedious work, but it was foolproof. Money always surfaces eventually, always. Except this time. Months passed, a year, 2 years. Not a single bill from the ransom turned up, not one. It was statistically impossible. 10,000 bills in circulation, and not one person anywhere tried to spend one? The FBI couldn't explain it. Maybe Cooper had died in the jump, and the money was buried with him in some remote ravine. That was the rational explanation, the likely explanation. But it was also possible that Cooper was smarter than they'd given him credit for. Maybe he'd laundered the money somehow, converting it through black market channels. Or maybe he was just patient, spending the bills a few at a time, carefully, never in ways that would trigger investigation. The case went cold, not officially closed but dormant. Agents were reassigned to other cases. The search teams disbanded. Life moved on. But the legend of D.B. Cooper only grew. Books were written. Television shows dramatized the story. He became a folk hero, a symbol of rebellion against authority, a man who'd beaten the system and disappeared into the mist. And then, 9 years later, the case exploded back to life. February 1980. A family vacation along the Columbia River. The Ingram family. Father, mother, and their 8-year-old son, Brian. They were staying near a place called Tina Bar, a sandy beach area, about 9 miles downstream from the town of Vancouver, Washington. It was a popular spot for camping, fishing, picnicking. Brian was playing near the water's edge, digging in the sand the way kids do, looking for interesting rocks or driftwood. His shovel hit something that didn't feel like sand. He dug deeper. His hand closed around something soft, rotted, matted together. He pulled it out. It looked like paper, old paper, falling apart, held together by rubber bands that crumbled at his touch. He called his father over. Harold Ingram took one look and felt his heart skip. He was looking at money, bundles of it, $20 bills so deteriorated they were barely recognizable, but definitely currency. He carefully excavated the area, finding 3 separate bundles. The bills were still bound by what had once been rubber bands, now just sticky residue. Harold made the call that would reignite the biggest mystery in American criminal history. The FBI arrived within hours. Special Agent Ralph Himmelsbach, now years into his obsession with the case, was notified immediately. He drove to Tina Bar himself, hardly daring to hope. The bills were carefully collected, preserved in evidence bags. Back at the lab, forensic specialists went to work. The serial numbers were faint, damaged by years of exposure to water and sand, but they were readable. The technicians cross-referenced them against the master list of Cooper's ransom money. Match. Perfect match. The bills were from the ransom, no question. 3 packets, approximately 290 bills total, amounting to $5,800, still bound in their original bank bundles. The news broke like a thunderclap. After 9 years of silence, D.B. Cooper's money had surfaced. The case was alive again. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. How did the money get to Tina Bar? The location was miles from the probable jump zone, downstream on the Columbia River. Had Cooper landed near the river? Had he dropped the money during the jump? Or had he made it to the ground alive, only to lose the money later, perhaps washed away in a flood? The bills were examined in minute detail. Forensic analysis revealed they'd been submerged in water, buried in sand. The deterioration pattern suggested they'd been there for most of the intervening 9 years, not recently deposited. They showed evidence of having been compressed, as if under weight or pressure. But here was the critical question. Why were only 3 packets found?
Cooper had jumped with $200,000. That was 10,000 bills, bound in packets of 100 bills each. 100 packets total. 3 had been found. Where were the other 97? The FBI launched a new search, this time focused on Tina Bar and the surrounding area. Volunteers came from across the country, amateur sleuths and Cooper obsessives who believed they could find what the FBI had missed. They sifted through sand, waded through shallows, used metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar. They found nothing more. Those 3 packets remained the only physical evidence directly connected to the hijacking. The only proof that any of the money had made it out of the airplane. Theories multiplied. Maybe Cooper had landed near a tributary of the Columbia. The impact had damaged the money bag, and a few packets had fallen out, eventually washing downstream to Tina Bar. The rest of the money, and Cooper himself, was somewhere upstream, buried in the forest or the river. Or maybe Cooper had survived. Maybe he'd buried the money near the river for safekeeping, planning to return for it later. But before he could, a flood had come. The Columbia River system was prone to flooding, especially in winter and spring. A major flood could have unearthed the money, carrying some of it downstream while leaving the rest buried deeper. Or maybe, just maybe, Cooper had deliberately planted the money, a false trail, meant to throw the FBI off his scent, to make them think he'd died when he was actually alive and well, living somewhere far away. Every explanation had problems. Every theory left questions unanswered. The FBI interviewed Brian Ingram extensively. Where exactly had he found the money? How deep was it buried? Were there any other items nearby? The boy did his best to remember, but he was 8 years old. He'd been playing in the sand. The exact location was uncertain, the details hazy. Geologists were brought in to study the sandbar. Hydrologists analyzed the river currents, trying to model how the money might have traveled. They ran computer simulations, tracked historical flood patterns, examined erosion rates. The conclusion was frustratingly vague. The money could have come from almost anywhere upstream. The possible source area was enormous, covering hundreds of square miles of river, tributaries, and adjacent forest. Special Agent Himmelsbach refused to give up. He personally walked the riverbanks for years, eyes always on the ground, hoping to spot another clue. He investigated hundreds of suspects, chased countless leads. Some were promising, most were dead ends. He became convinced that Cooper had died in the jump. The money at Tina Bar, in his view, was proof of death, not survival. A dead man can't spend money. A dead man can't hide evidence. The forest had simply kept its secret. But others disagreed. Cooper enthusiasts, amateur detectives, conspiracy theorists. They believed he'd survived. They pointed to the lack of a body, to the careful planning that suggested a man who wouldn't leave his fate to chance, to the tantalizing possibility that somewhere, someone was quietly living off $200,000 in carefully laundered bills. The case officially remained open. The FBI continued to accept tips, investigate leads, interview suspects. But resources dwindled. Other cases took priority. Agents retired. Files gathered dust.
In 2016, 45 years after the hijacking, the FBI officially closed the case. Not solved, just closed. They'd exhausted every lead, followed every clue, interviewed thousands of suspects. After the longest and most expensive investigation in bureau history, they had nothing. 3 packets of rotted money and a collection of theories. The statement was simple. The FBI has redirected resources allocated to the D.B. Cooper case in order to focus on other investigative priorities. The case will remain an inactive case unless specific physical evidence emerges.
But closing a case doesn't kill a legend. If anything, it made Cooper's story more powerful. The FBI, with all its technology and expertise, had failed. The mystery remained unsolved. The man remained unknown. Was he at the bottom of a ravine? Bones scattered by animals? Briefcase full of money rotting beside him? Or was he an old man now, in his 90s if he'd lived, sitting somewhere warm, watching documentaries about himself, smiling at how close they'd come, but never quite catching him? We'll probably never know. The forest keeps its secrets, the river keeps its dead, and D.B. Cooper, whoever he really was, has kept the greatest secret of all. His name, his face, his fate. 3 simple things. And 50 years later, we still don't have the answer to any of them. The money sits in an evidence locker somewhere. Those 3 rotted packets. Proof that something happened, but not proof of what. The case file sits, archived. Thousands of pages of interviews, theories, dead ends. The legend sits in our collective imagination, growing with each retelling. And somewhere, in the dark forests of Washington, or the cold waters of the Columbia, or perhaps in a grave marked with another man's name, D.B. Cooper rests, silent, unknown, victorious. The perfect crime isn't one where you get away with the money. It's one where you get away with the mystery. And in that sense, Dan Cooper succeeded beyond any criminal in American history. He didn't just rob a plane. He robbed us of certainty, of closure, of the ending to the story. And maybe that's the greatest heist of all.
The case file sits in a federal archive somewhere, thousands of pages thick. Witness statements, flight records, forensic reports, suspect profiles, dead ends, a monument to frustration, built one failed lead at a time over nearly half a century. But the story of D.B. Cooper doesn't live in that file. It lives somewhere else entirely, in books and movies, in bar conversations and conspiracy theories, in the imagination of everyone who's ever dreamed of disappearing, of starting over, of beating impossible odds. D.B. Cooper didn't just hijack a plane, he hijacked our collective consciousness. And unlike Flight 305, he never landed. The transformation began almost immediately. Within days of the hijacking, Cooper was already becoming something more than a criminal. Newspaper editorials debated his motives. Television commentators analyzed his methods. People who would normally condemn law-breaking found themselves reluctantly admiring his audacity. This was 1971, remember. America was exhausted. The Vietnam War dragged on, claiming lives and dividing the nation. Watergate was on the horizon. Trust in institutions, in government, in authority itself, was crumbling. Into this atmosphere of cynicism and disillusionment stepped a man in a business suit who calmly, politely, impossibly beat the system. He didn't hurt anyone, didn't fire a weapon, didn't make political demands or manifestos. He just took the money and jumped. It was pure, almost innocent in its simplicity. A victimless crime, people said, ignoring the terror of the crew, the cost to the airline, the resources spent searching for him. The folk hero was born. Songs were written about him. Country ballads celebrating the man who got away. Rock anthems about jumping into the unknown. By the mid-1970s, you could buy D.B. Cooper t-shirts, Cooper bumper stickers, Cooper Halloween costumes. An entire cottage industry sprang up around a man whose real face no one had ever photographed. In the Pacific Northwest, he became a regional icon. Bars were named after him. Annual festivals celebrated the anniversary of the jump. Skydivers reenacted his leap, trying to prove it was possible, trying to solve the mystery through recreation. Some of these jumpers nearly died in the attempt, which only added to the legend. If it was almost impossible, that made Cooper's success all the more remarkable. But behind the legend, the investigation ground on. Less visible now, less urgent, but relentless. The FBI maintained a suspect list that eventually grew to over 1,000 names. Every tip was followed up, every lead investigated, and over the decades, certain suspects rose to prominence, capturing public imagination almost as much as Cooper himself. Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. was the first serious candidate. In April 1972, just 5 months after Cooper's jump, McCoy hijacked a United Airlines flight using an almost identical method: business suit, bomb threat, parachutes, and money. He even jumped from the rear stairs of a Boeing 727. But McCoy was sloppy, where Cooper had been meticulous. He left fingerprints. He was identified. Within days, he was arrested at his home in Utah. The FBI interrogated him extensively about the Northwest hijacking. Could he be Cooper? The physical description was close. His skydiving expertise was proven. His financial situation gave him motive. But the alibi held. McCoy had been home in Utah on Thanksgiving Eve, surrounded by family. Witnesses confirmed it. The fingerprints found on Cooper's plane didn't match McCoy's. The handwriting was different. And perhaps most tellingly, McCoy's personality didn't fit. Where Cooper had been calm and controlled, McCoy was aggressive, even violent. He was convicted and sent to prison, where he later escaped and was killed in a shootout with FBI agents. Not Cooper, just a copycat, an echo of the original. Kenneth Christensen emerged as a suspect in 2003, years after his death.
His brother Lyle came forward with suspicions that had haunted him for decades. Kenneth had been a flight attendant for Northwest Orient. He knew the Boeing 727 intimately. He bore a striking resemblance to the composite sketch, particularly around the eyes and jawline. And in the years after the hijacking, he'd suddenly come into money, buying property, living beyond his apparent means. The theory was compelling, perhaps too compelling. Television shows investigated, books were written, but the evidence remained circumstantial. Christensen's friends denied it vehemently. His DNA, tested years later, didn't match the samples taken from Cooper's tie. The FBI remained unconvinced. Another suspect, Robert Rackstraw, an experienced pilot and paratrooper with a criminal record. He fit the physical description. He had the skills. He'd been living in the Pacific Northwest at the time, and he had a history of con artistry and deception that suggested the kind of mind capable of planning such a crime. Rackstraw became the focus of intense investigation, including a 2016 documentary series that claimed to have solved the case. Coded letters were analyzed. Veterans were interviewed. A circumstantial case was built, brick by brick, but again, no definitive proof. Rackstraw denied everything until his death in 2019, taking whatever secrets he had to the grave. The parade of suspects continued. Dwayne Webber, who allegedly confessed to his wife on his deathbed. Sheridan Peterson, a former smoke jumper with the right skills and wrong alibi. Lynn Doyle Cooper, whose surname seemed too coincidental. Barbara Dayton, one of the few female suspects, a transgender woman who claimed to have inside knowledge. Each theory had adherents. Each had evidence that seemed convincing in isolation. But none had the one thing that mattered: proof. The FBI's forensic team kept working. They analyzed the tie Cooper left behind, extracting DNA, searching for trace evidence. They found pollen particles that suggested Cooper had been in a rural area before the hijacking. They found rare earth elements that might indicate he'd worked in certain industries. They found titanium particles that opened new avenues of investigation. But identifying particles doesn't identify a person. The clues pointed in too many directions, creating a constellation of possibilities rather than a clear trail. In 2011, on the 40th anniversary of the hijacking, the FBI made a public appeal. They released new information about the case. They asked for help. The response was overwhelming. Tips flooded in from across the country, from across the world. Amateur sleuths formed communities online, sharing theories, debating evidence, conducting their own investigations. Some of these citizen detectives were brilliant. They found connections the FBI had missed. They tracked down witnesses no one had interviewed in decades. They applied modern technology to old evidence, digital enhancement to faded photographs, computer modeling to flight paths and jump physics. Others were simply obsessed. seeing Cooper's face in every old photograph, his presence in every unsolved mystery. The line between investigation and obsession blurred. Marriages broke up over the case, careers were abandoned. People spent their life savings chasing leads that went nowhere. The phenomenon said something profound about human nature. We need answers. We need closure. An unsolved mystery is an open wound in the collective psyche, and we can't help but pick at it, trying to make it heal. But some wounds don't heal. Some mysteries don't solve. And perhaps that's not a weakness. Perhaps that's the point. The discovery at Tina Bar in 1980 should have provided closure. It proved Cooper's money had made it to the ground. It gave searchers a specific area to focus on. But instead, it only deepened the mystery. 3 packets of bills and nothing else. No more money, no parachute, no body.
No answers. Their offerings about the money multiplied. Maybe Cooper had buried it all, and a flood had unearthed only those 3 packets. Maybe animals had scattered the rest. Maybe Cooper himself had returned years later and collected what remained, leaving only what he couldn't find. Or maybe the 3 packets had never been in Cooper's possession at all. Maybe they'd separated during the jump, torn away by the wind, while Cooper landed safely miles away, with the bulk of the money still secured to his body. Every explanation raised new questions. Every answer demanded another question. It was a maze with no exit, a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit any configuration. In 2016, the FBI made their announcement. After 45 years, the active investigation was being suspended. Not closed, they emphasized. Suspended. If new evidence emerged, they'd reopen, but they weren't going to chase old leads anymore. Weren't going to interview the same suspects again. Weren't going to walk the same forests and drag the same rivers. They'd done everything humanly possible, and it wasn't enough. The statement was professional, measured, but you could read the frustration between the lines. This was the bureau that had hunted down John Dillinger, captured the Unabomber, dismantled organized crime families, and they'd been beaten by a man in a clip-on tie. The public reaction was mixed. Some people were disappointed. They'd been waiting decades for resolution. Others were oddly satisfied. The mystery would remain a mystery. The legend would remain a legend. D.B. Cooper would never be reduced to a mugshot and a psychological profile. He would stay forever what he'd always been. A shadow, a question mark, a ghost. Because here's the truth about D.B. Cooper. We don't actually want to solve the case. Not really. We say we do. We claim we do. We spend our time and energy and resources trying. But deep down, we want the mystery to survive. We want to believe that somewhere, somehow, someone beat the odds and got away with it. We want to believe in the impossible escape. It's the same reason we love magic tricks, even though we know they're illusions. The same reason we watch movies where the underdog wins against impossible odds. We need stories where the little guy outsmarts the system, where careful planning and audacity can overcome institutional power, where one person, alone, can change their destiny. D.B. Cooper gave us that story, and the fact that we don't know how it ends makes it perfect. Any ending would be a disappointment. If we found his bones in the forest, he'd become just another failed criminal. If we identified him as a living person, he'd become just another old man with a past. The mystery is what makes him immortal. So maybe it's fitting that the case was suspended, not solved. Maybe it's appropriate that after all the searching, all the investigating, all the theorizing, we're left exactly where we started, with a question. Who was Dan Cooper? Not D.B. Cooper. That was a media mistake, a misreading of the ticket by a reporter, but it stuck. The real ticket said Dan Cooper. Just Dan. An ordinary name. The kind of name that could belong to anyone. Maybe that was the point. He could be anyone. He could be anywhere. He could be alive or dead, rich or poor, regretful or triumphant. He could be the old man sitting next to you on a bus, or the bones in an unmarked grave, or a myth that never existed the way we remember it. The evidence is sparse. A tie, some money, witness descriptions that vary in crucial details, flight data, a pressure change at 8:13 p.m. That's all we have. Everything else is speculation, theory, hope, and imagination. But from those fragments, we've built a legend. We've constructed an entire mythology around a man who existed in our lives for less than 4 hours. From 3:07 p.m., when Flight 305 took off from Portland, to 8:13 p.m., when something or someone dropped from the rear stairs into the darkness.
4 hours, that's all. And 50 years later, we're still talking about it. That's the legacy of D.B. Cooper. Not the hijacking, not the money, not even the jump. The legacy is the question. The eternal, unanswerable question that keeps us coming back, keeps us searching, keeps us wondering. Did he make it? It's a simple question. Binary. Yes or no. Dead or alive. Success or failure. But we'll never know. The forest is too deep. The river is too cold. Time is too long. The truth is buried too deep, if it exists at all. And so we're left with the mystery, left with the silence, left with the empty seat where he sat, the empty sky where he jumped, the empty place in history where his name should be. All we have is the story. And the story has no ending. It just stops. Mid-flight, mid-fall, mid-mystery. Somewhere in the darkness of a November night in 1971, a man stepped off the stairs of an airplane and vanished. Where he landed, whether he survived, who he really was, these are questions without answers, mysteries without solutions, stories without endings. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be, because the greatest crime D.B. Cooper ever committed wasn't hijacking a plane or stealing $200,000. It was stealing our certainty, our closure, our ending. He left us suspended, forever falling through darkness, never knowing if we'll find ground or just keep falling into mystery. And 50 years later, we're still falling, still wondering, still searching for a man who may never have wanted to be found. The plane landed. The passengers went home. The crew eventually retired. The investigators grew old and died. But the question remains, eternal and unchanging. Who was Dan Cooper? And where did he go? Listen. Can you hear it? The hum of jet engines, the whistle of wind, the silence of an empty forest. That's the sound of the mystery. That's the sound of D.B. Cooper, forever falling, forever gone, forever ours.
There are mysteries, and then there are voids. Mysteries suggest solutions waiting to be found, puzzles with pieces scattered but present. Voids are different. Their absence is so complete they become their own kind of presence. The story of D.B. Cooper is not a mystery, it's a void, and that void has been staring back at us for over 50 years. The FBI keeps the evidence in their archive. Somewhere in a climate-controlled facility, in a box labeled with a case number, lies everything physical that remains of Dan Cooper's brief intersection with history. The black clip-on tie, still clipped, as if waiting for its owner to return. The 3 packets of rotted $20 bills, preserved in plastic, their serial numbers still legible despite years in the sand and water. The cigarette butts, analyzed for DNA that revealed nothing useful. A few fibers, some microscope slides with particles of pollen and metal. Photographs of parachutes and bourbon glasses and an empty seat. That's all. The material legacy of a man who changed aviation security forever, who launched the longest manhunt in FBI history, who became a cultural icon. A tie and some money and cigarette butts. It seems impossibly small. But then again, so was the man. Average height, average build, average face. He made himself small, unremarkable, forgettable. And in doing so, he became unforgettable. The case file itself is enormous. Thousands of pages accumulated over decades. Witness statements that contradict each other in subtle ways. Florence Schaffner remembered his eyes as brown. Tina Mucklow thought they might have been dark hazel. One passenger recalled him as olive-skinned. Another said he looked pale. The composite sketch shows a man who could be Italian, or Greek, or Mexican, or just a deeply tanned white man. He's everyone and no one. The flight data is precise. Altitude, airspeed, heading, the exact moment of the pressure change. But precise data about the plane tells us nothing about the man. He jumped somewhere over southwestern Washington, probably near the border with Oregon. That narrows it down to several hundred square miles of forest, mountain, and river. It's like saying someone is somewhere in Rhode Island. True, but not helpful. We've retraced his journey so many times it's worn a groove in our collective memory. The ticket, purchased at 2 p.m., The boarding at 2:50 p.m., the note passed at 3:20 p.m., the hours circling Seattle, the landing at 5:24 p.m., the passenger release, the second takeoff at 7:40 p.m., the jump at 8:13 p.m., each timestamp a milestone on a path that leads nowhere. We know what he did. We don't know why. We don't know how it ended. We don't know who he was. If he survived, he'd be old now, very old. Born probably in the 1920s, which would make him over 100, or in the early 1930s, which would put him in his 90s. Statistically, he's likely dead by now, even if the jump didn't kill him. Age would have. But here's the haunting part. If he survived, if he made it out of those woods and lived a normal life under a different name, he spent the last 50 years looking over his shoulder. Every knock on the door could be the FBI. Every transaction with a $20 bill could be the one that gives him away. Every time someone mentions D.B. Cooper, he'd have to control his face, maintain his expression, give nothing away. Imagine living like that for 50 years. The money would be worthless. Not financially, $200,000 is $200,000, but psychologically. Every dollar spent is a risk. Every purchase is a calculation. The very thing he risked his life for becomes a burden, a trap, evidence of his guilt that he can never fully use or fully dispose of. Maybe he burned it, buried it, threw it in a river. Maybe the 3 packets found at Tina Bar were all that remained, because Cooper himself destroyed the rest, deciding that freedom was worth more than money. It's possible.
It would explain why no other bills ever surfaced. It would explain everything and nothing. Or maybe he did spend it, carefully, strategically, a few bills at a time in places where they wouldn't be checked. Gas stations in remote areas, small-town diners, yard sales and flea markets, places where cash is common and questions are rare. Maybe some of those bills passed through your hands. Maybe you held D.B. Cooper's ransom money and never knew it. The thought is both thrilling and disturbing. But if he died in the jump, as most experts believe, his end was likely quick and brutal. The impact of hitting ground at terminal velocity, even with a parachute, in the dark, in unfamiliar terrain. He could have hit a tree, broken his back, died slowly in the cold and rain. He could have landed in a river, the weight of the money dragging him under. He could have miscalculated everything and simply slammed into a mountainside. The forest would have claimed him. Decomposition, animals, weather. Within months, there would be nothing left but bones. Within years, even those would scatter and fade. The forest has kept its secrets for millennia. One more body, one more mystery would be nothing unusual. And yet, we can't quite believe it. Can't quite accept that someone who planned everything so carefully would have left his survival to chance. The jump window, the weather, the terrain. These were variables he couldn't fully control. But everything else, the flight parameters, the parachutes, the money, the timing, all of it was so precise, so well thought out. Would a man capable of that level of planning really have gambled everything on a blind jump into darkness? Maybe he knew something we don't. Maybe he'd studied the area, hiked it, knew exactly where he wanted to land. Maybe he'd cached supplies, stashed a motorcycle or a car, planned his exit as carefully as his entry. Maybe the jump wasn't desperate. Maybe it was just the final step in a flawless plan.
We'll never know. That's the truth of it. The simple, frustrating, liberating truth. We'll never know. The FBI's suspension of the case in 2016 was an acknowledgement of reality. They'd chased every lead, investigated every suspect, searched every forest, dragged every river, applied every new technology as it became available, DNA testing, digital enhancement, computer modeling. Nothing worked. The case defeated them, not because they weren't good enough, but because some cases can't be solved, some voids can't be filled. The statement they released was professional, carefully worded. But between the lines you could read the exhaustion, the frustration, the admission that they'd been beaten by a ghost, the greatest law enforcement agency in the world, with unlimited resources and half a century to work, and they had nothing. Nothing but a tie and some money and questions. But here's what they didn't understand, what perhaps they couldn't understand given their position. The world didn't want them to solve it. Not really. We said we did. We claimed we were desperate for answers. But deep down, we wanted the mystery to survive. We needed it to survive. Because D.B. Cooper represents something fundamental about the human spirit.
the desire to escape, to start over, to beat impossible odds, to disappear and reinvent ourselves. We all feel trapped sometimes, by jobs, by debt, by circumstances, by expectations. And Cooper showed us that escape is possible, difficult, dangerous, maybe even fatal, but possible. He's a pressure valve for the modern psyche. When life feels overwhelming, when the system feels unbeatable, we can think of Cooper and imagine, just for a moment, what it would be like to jump, to leave it all behind, to vanish into the night and never look back. That's why we tell his story. That's why it endures. Not because of what he did, but because of what he represents. Freedom, audacity, the possibility of the impossible. Every time we board a plane,
We walk through the security theater he created. Metal detectors, X-ray machines, locked cockpit doors, reinforced air stairs that can't be opened in flight. His legacy is written into the very architecture of modern aviation. We live in a world shaped by his 4 hours of infamy. But more than that, every time we see someone in a business suit, every time we notice a clip-on tie, every time we hear about an unsolved case, we think of him. He's become part of our cultural DNA, a reference point, a touchstone. He's entered the realm of myth alongside Bigfoot and UFOs and the Loch Ness Monster. Except unlike those, we know D.B. Cooper was real. We have the ticket stub to prove it. The debate continues. Online forums dedicated to the case see posts every day. New theories, new suspects, new interpretations of old evidence. People spend their evenings and weekends diving into archives, interviewing witnesses, walking the forests where he might have landed. It's become a hobby, a obsession, a community. Some of these people are convinced they've solved it. They've found the real Cooper, identified him conclusively. But their proof is always circumstantial, always just shy of definitive, always one piece short of completion. And when pressed, when challenged, the theory falls apart. Not completely, just enough. Just enough to leave room for doubt. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the pursuit is the purpose. Maybe we don't solve the case because we don't truly want to solve it. We want to chase it, to investigate, to theorize, to wonder. The journey matters more than the destination. The question matters more than the answer. In a world where everything is documented, where privacy is extinct, where every moment is captured and stored and searchable, D.B. Cooper reminds us that disappearance is still possible, that there are still places the cameras can't see, still moments that go unrecorded, still secrets that stay secret. He jumped into a void, and the void swallowed him. But in doing so, he left behind a void in us, a gap in our knowledge, an itch we can't scratch, a question we can't answer. And that void has taken on a life of its own, growing with each retelling, deepening with each year, becoming more permanent than any answer could ever be. The truth is, we don't need to know what happened to D.B. Cooper. We already know. He did exactly what he set out to do. He escaped, not just from the plane, not just from the FBI, but from definition itself. He became unknowable, became a question mark, became myth. And myths don't die. They can't. They exist outside of time, outside of fact, outside of proof. They exist in the space between what we know and what we imagine, and that space is infinite. So when people ask, what happened to D.B. Cooper? The answer is simple. Nothing happened to him. He happened to us. He stepped off that plane and into our imagination. And that's where he's lived ever since. Not in a grave, not on a beach, but in the stories we tell, the questions we ask, the void we can't fill. He's still falling, still jumping, still disappearing, forever suspended in that moment between the plane and the ground, between known and unknown, between man and myth. And we're still watching, still wondering, still hoping that somewhere, somehow, against all odds, he made it. Because if he made it, then maybe we can too. Maybe we can escape our own traps. Maybe we can beat our own impossible odds. Maybe we can jump into our own darkness and find, on the other side, not death, but freedom. That's the enduring legacy of D.B. Cooper. Not crime, not money, not even mystery. Hope. The stubborn, irrational, beautiful hope that escape is possible. That we're not as trapped as we think. That somewhere there's a door marked exit, and all we have to do is be brave enough to step through it. Dan Cooper stepped through that door on November 24th, 1971. He stepped off the back of an aeroplane into a storm, into darkness, into history.
And he never came back.
But he never left either. He's still here. In every unsolved mystery, in every desperate plan, in every moment when someone looks at their life and wonders, what if I just disappeared? He's the answer to a question we're afraid to ask, the solution to a problem we can't admit we have, the escape route we'll never take but always imagine. The plane landed, the money rotted, the witnesses died, the investigators retired. But the void remains, growing, deepening, calling. And somewhere in that void, D.B. Cooper waits, not for us to find him, but for us to understand what he always knew. Some mysteries are meant to be solved, and some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious, to stay open, to keep asking. Who was Dan Cooper? Where did he go? Did he survive? Listen closely. The void is answering. Not with words, with silence, with absence, with the eternal, unchanging sound of a question that has no answer. And that sound, that beautiful, terrible silence, is the only ending this story ever needed.